Hello and welcome to episode 7 of After This. Today we're actually dealing with a question introduced by someone on Reddit, so I've been waiting for a while to finally get into something like that. But first we'll introduce ourselves. I'm Daniel.
My name is Carla.
And I'm Shannon.
And hopefully we can actually do this question some justice. I mean, it was a pretty long question with a lot of details, so it's probably going to be a lot broader than maybe you'd like us to deal with each particular topic. And maybe it's something that we'd come back to later, but this is kind of going to be a bit of a broad view with probably a lot of tangents, as we usually do. We are pretty good at tangents, actually.
Yeah,
we
tends
are.
to happen.
We're very good. It's a talent. It's a talent. So the first thing is, the first note was why the League of Nations and the UN failed. So that's a pretty big question itself. I mean, the League of Nations was what was set up at the end of World War One, and the UN was what was set up at the end of World War Two. You could say one was more successful, obviously.
Is it really fair to say the UN has failed in the past?
Oh, yeah.
Like it's...
Failed? I mean, I guess that's the thing, isn't it? How do you define failure?
Yeah.
I mean,
it still exists.
No, it does. I mean, it's like a lightning rod for positive thinking, I guess you'd call it.
Yeah.
It doesn't translate well to action, but it's a great thing where people can sort of see something material, and it at least fills that mental void for where is something at least where we're cooperating or something.
It's that kind of conceptual some symbol, I suppose.
Yeah, it's symbolic.
Yeah, it's symbolic.
That's what it is. It's symbolic.
So it works in theory.
Yes, it works. Yeah, exactly. It works in theory. It's a place where people talk. And not an enormous amount happens, but stuff happens. The idea of it, though, is like, I mean, so the League of Nations, at the end of World War One, they said, well, that was horrible. So, they sat down and said, let's make a union or a league, as they called it, which was basically, within this league, we all talk and talk out our problems, and hopefully we never have to have World War One again. And obviously, some people participated more than others. And then the Germans did their secret build-up and attacked everyone because of a variety of reasons that I don't need to go into. But the thing is, it didn't really work. Because obviously people weren't talking and they were secretly building a military to attack everyone with.
Yes.
So, League of Nations didn't really play out because people weren't really... And I think it suffered from a lot of the same problems that the UN does. It's just the UN is more established.
And was World War II the downfall of the League of Nations? Did it kind of disband at that point?
Yeah, I mean, I think it had kind of only had a few years, or like 5 years, where it was kind of like, yeah, this is something. And it's like, technically it was still there.
Right.
But then World War II happened, and then everyone sort of just let it go and
Okay.
never brought it back. It's like let's just pretend we didn't delude ourselves for that much time.
Yeah.
And the thing is, it had no material power. It's the same problem with the UN. The thing is, it was just a place for people to talk, and they sort of under the informal agreement that they would get along, that they would talk out their problems and so on, that we wouldn't have to fight again. But obviously, just informal agreement really doesn't get you very far, because there's always going to be a few people, or one at the very least, that has their own ideas.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the UN happened after World War II, and the UN was like a much bigger thing.
So do you reckon its failure, the League of Nations failure, has done more harm than good?
I think, honestly, the UN's failure has done more harm than good. I think the League of Nations was kind of this weird experiment that really didn't have much of an impact on anything, except I think... Actually, no, what I would probably say is that after World War II, they remembered the League of Nations and they said, good idea, terrible execution.
Mm-hmm.
Let's do a better job. But the problem was, it had its own problems again. So the second iteration had its own issues. I mean, the thing is, at the end, they basically said, okay, we need something much bigger and more established, with voting systems and things like that built into it. But obviously, what it actually was a lot of people could come and turn up and talk and banter, but then you had the P5, the Permanent 5 Members of the Security Council, who were the winners of World War II.
Yeah. So
it's the UK, France, China, Russia, and America. And those 5 are basically the emperors of the UN.
It's interesting that that's still, 60 years later, and that hasn't
Oh,
change?
there's a lot of things that say, for instance, that France especially shouldn't be there anymore because
Yeah.
it's not really relevant.
Mm.
That perhaps someone like Japan or Germany or something could be taking their spot.
Yeah.
But it's so rigid, and that's the problem. Is it's so like it's set up to be one particular thing, which is these 5 countries get to do whatever they want, and everyone else has to listen, kind of thing. And it's kind of kept France, I think, a bit up in the prestige land a bit by being able to stay there. Because the other thing is, those are the only 5 countries in the world that are allowed to have nuclear weapons.
Right.
Anyone outside of those 5 is not allowed to have them. It's just
And
a
yet
few
has
of them.
like,
A few of them, and that's the thing is,
but I guess
it's,
that's
it's,
an
it's-
instance of it not
Exactly,
really working.
exactly.
Is that
It's
what they're
basically
doing?
they have all these nuclear inspectors and things, and they'll send Hans Blix
Oh,
out.
Yes.
Exactly, they'll send Hans Blix out to write his sternly worded letter to Team America.
Is it Team
Yeah,
America?
Team
Right, I
America,
was
because he
like,
goes
is
and
this
gives
a
them the
sequel?
letter. Yeah, no,
Yeah,
it's from Team America, and that's exactly what happens. Is it's the sternly worded letter, and it's meant to be like sanctions and stuff come after, but it's where it's complicated is that half the P5 has different allies to the other P5.
Yeah.
They were all friends at the end of World War II, and then they've quickly not were friends anymore.
Yes, I think
And-
it's safe to say that China, Russia, and America are not
Exactly.
friends.
I mean, I think that's one of the biggest problems that stops it from developing into something more useful is that ultimately the P5 has all the power,
Yeah.
and they have veto powers.
Yeah.
So the thing is, Russia wants to help some group. So he keeps wanting to help Assad, and America keeps wanting to help the rebels.
Yeah.
And they can't agree, so they keep vetoing each other, and then they just do whatever they want individually.
Right.
So the UN is powerless. The UN is effective when all 5 members want to do the same thing, which is super likely and often, as you can imagine.
Yeah, and surely something like that would probably happen anyway. Although,
Yeah.
you know, they do. Do they do like research papers and that kind of thing?
Yeah,
Is it
people
kind of-
that they
you think of
do.
it more like a think tank rather
What-
than a political.
So the UN does things like
Entity.
write papers about why you shouldn't attack Iraq in 2003, and then
Yeah.
America listens to those papers.
well.
So the thing is, the UN is exactly that, but it's all down to who's listening.
Yeah.
And that's what they do. They do a huge amount of research into
Yeah.
like human rights stuff and global warming and just like the effect of everything on everything. There's a lot of very smart people there because
So if you argue it as like a think tank and as a kind of more
Yeah.
research institution, you could
Yeah.
probably count rather than saying it's failed.
oh yeah, no look I it probably does more good than harm.
Yeah,
The
okay.
only
I think that's what I was
harm
going for.
that I think it does is that it becomes a wasted effort.
Yeah.
So the thing is that you might have 1,000 people that in a previous era might have gone into all their own governments and influenced them somehow to do something positive, but in this instance instead, they've gone to the UN and talked a lot and influenced virtually nothing.
Right.
And it's kind of like, it's a bit of a black hole of effort, which is what I was saying the other day.
You can tell I'm from an academic background. I'm like, yeah, that sounds good. Not really.
But it's in terms of like getting these people together to make these papers. If someone out there actually reads them and does something with them, then it is a net win. And the information is being created. It's just that in the age of the internet, the information simply being there is obviously not enough, as we have with anti-vaxxers and everyone else. But yes, the UN is more like a continuation of national power. The UN is meant to be something where everything comes together, but really it's a continuation of these 5 major powers, and the entire system is basically set up so that they get to do what they want still. And that's kind of like just the way things were in the age of the empires, where the big countries in Europe were just allowed to do whatever they wanted. They can veto each other, but at the same time, the UN is meant to be a conduit for things. And if a small country does something one of the big ones don't like, they'll just veto it.
Yeah.
And so nothing happens. And so to get anything through the UN, it has to be either completely agreeable, i.e. the couple of wars they've actually been involved in, which was the Gulf War and the Balkans War with Serbia, or it has to be so small that no one gets hurt and no one gets annoyed, in which case it's like a lot of aid in Africa and things like that. So, like, again, net gain,
Yeah.
but it's so much effort that could have been put towards something more useful. So, I mean, in terms of looking at it in a way that it's a framework to unify countries and bring together some new era of humanity and some democratic place, it doesn't really do that. It creates benefits, but it's that primary mission is not really being achieved by the UN. It's just, anyway, yeah, so that's, like, we probably should come back and do the UN in piece by piece as a full thing, so I can actually go through all the facilities and everything, because I think you're right, it is actually an entire episode, and I can probably think of a few ways to do that.
You've made it to the complete episode of this UN. Congratulations.
It's made it like 3 times, like we
Yeah,
keep saying that, and I need to come back and do it, but like this time it's a short piece.
Alright, that's it.
It's a little bit of this one, so because there's like 5 other things I have to touch on.
It's like, it's like that tasty bit of food on the plate. You're like, I really should get through this.
So you keep just having a little bit of it,
Shut
a
that
little
UN.
bit of it. I need to eat that eventually.
The
I like
tasty sauce of the UN.
that's it works, so I can't really cut into you too much. So the second one is to do with Pan-Arab and Pan-African movements. So this is something that I've heard a bit about. I had to go out and research this more because the thing is my understanding of it wasn't really thorough enough. One of the big things that was a big obstacle with both of these, so there have been Pan-Arab and Pan-African movements, but I was looking them up, and one of the big things that happened was every time they'd announce something, but then they'd announce they were planning on making something or making some organization, but then they'd all come together and none of them would want to be the sub-king to another king.
Yeah.
So, like, that happened with the emirs, that happened with the king, like the kings and presidents in Africa and things. They all thought they were going to have a more primary role, I think, by being part of this bigger thing, but then they realized everyone else had the same idea, and they weren't really coming into it with the mentality of making like a council or a new election system or something. It was kind of like, I'm going to be a bigger piece of a bigger pie kind of thing that I am now. And I think, I mean, that mentality is going to exist with unified stuff, because everyone's probably going to think, oh, you unify, it means I get 2 countries. You know, it's like, not really. But I can see...
like it's something it'd be more easy to do with healthy democracies, with a person in power. They know they're only going to be in power for 5 years anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas if you've got things with people that are keeping power for their entire lives, that's a lot more to lose.
Yeah, you do have a lot more like people sort of gaming the system to be presidents for life and stuff in developing countries. And especially in developing countries where you've kind of got a new country and the rule of law and the institutions and everything are still kind of weak.
Yeah.
Usually you have a much more strongman leader in those countries because it's a compensation mechanism.
Yeah, and if people feel like they're in chaos, that's when strong leaders that can be a bit more authoritarian.
They usually, and as long as they're getting stuff back, they usually are more prone to voting for those people.
Yeah.
And like, because that's the thing, these people get voted in by actual elections. It's just that they then don't let themselves get voted out.
Yeah.
But the other thing I wanted to bring up with related to both of those is it's a bit of a weird thing to explain. It relates to a few of these other points. Is that you're creating an identity that's still a piece of a bigger world, if you know what I mean. Like you're not advocating for the absolute abolition of pieces. You're basically just saying we're going to make a slightly larger piece, but we're still going to be dealing with America. We're still going to be dealing with China. We're still going to be dealing with Russia. Like, they're all still going to have the same pressures. It's just they're weighing up the benefits of being one blob versus being smaller blobs versus those. And I think in a lot of ways that kind of screws with things because it's like I feel like I could gain more advantage from those big powers by being a small piece than a big one.
Yeah.
Sometimes, like, and especially if you're your own king of your own little fiefdom and it's like, I have to give up this and I have to get that and whatever, maybe I'd rather just keep safe and, you know, keep my taxes low and suck in trade and things like that. I think, but it's mainly the first one that seemed to hold things up. The second one is more my interpretation, but it's the fact that whenever they came together, they weren't really able to agree on a structure. And that's why I think you need to start with some kind of ideology to begin with, of like established democracies and things where it's like, we're going to come together and we're going to have a complete like election process.
Yeah.
So the people that would bring it together would probably have to be from parties that supported the concept.
Yeah.
So the leaders would come together and say, we're all acknowledging that we're kind of relinquishing our authority to a new better, greater authority, a more human-based authority. And I think you'd need that in there, in the mentality.
Sounds like a lot of moving pieces to line up.
It does. And I think that's the big thing. It's what I was talking about last time, about like ideological first, before thing is you need to have all the people, and you need to have a party that believes in the concept of dissolving into a larger republic.
Yeah, because I can really see like an internal election, and if one of the parties is running on joining a different collective, that's gonna have a lot of resistance, especially if the other countries that are also involved are primed and ready to go.
Yeah.
And then this last one, I think the people would probably not vote for them.
Unless, that's the thing.
Said, as we were talking about a few episodes ago, you don't need to have that ground soil and that bottom.
And that's the problem. If you came from the top and you just had this party suddenly say, we're going to do this thing, but most of the people distrusted it, it would just get shot in the foot. They'd find a way to stop it. They'd riot, they'd protest, they'd oust the government, whatever it is, they'd stop it. That's why you'd need to
have some kind of referendum to get the people to approve it, I think.
Yeah, and the thing is, it would happen probably piece by piece anyway. Like, you'd have like a few of them that you could figure out, and they blob together, and then there'd be a few more, and you'd have to figure out how to amalgamate them, and then they'd blob in. It would kind of be like, you know, a really messy EU sort of thing, where it's like, you have to pass certain things and do it. It's going to be really complicated, functionally. It's just, I think, having a political party, like, that supports it, I think is actually going to be pretty vital.
Yeah,
because it's going to have to be part of the national strategy to dissolve into this thing.
Necessary but not sufficient.
Yeah. No, I definitely never said this is going to be easy. But actually, I wanted to verse that against ASEAN as well. So it's the Association, I think, of Southeast Asian Nations.
Okay.
They're not actually like turning into one country, but in terms of like a pan-area movement, I read about it in this book by Dr. Mahbubani, who is in Singapore, and he wrote this book called The Great Convergence, which is about how everything is slowly sort of like coming together kind of thing. And he made this point about ASEAN, that they do all this stuff together now. Like, as an association of countries, they've actually done quite a lot, like between Malaysia and Indonesia and Vietnam and stuff.
Okay.
To create a cooperative kind of economic environment. It's not quite EU level, but like it's coming together sort of thing. It's just as an example of one that has worked out, because they've all sort of understood they're better off being smaller pieces of this larger piece, so this larger whole, and it's worked out really well. I didn't have time to actually bring up examples and everything, but I remember reading the chapters in that book. So if you wanted examples, go read The Great Convergence. It's very good, but that's where you'll hear all the stuff about ASEAN. So the next point was about third worldist movements, and in particular, the one that was raised was China's Yafei La. I'd never heard of Yafei La before, but apparently it was basically a merging of like these third world nations, or this idea that they had of creating an association of third world nations, like between Latin America and Asia and Africa, all these developing countries that they would sort of like prime with communist revolutions to sort of bring them up, so then they can turn it into kind of this Chinese version of the Soviet Union.
Okay.
So, I mean, that's kind of what the Soviets were doing themselves with the Comintern that I was telling you about last time. So they were both kind of racing to turn these developing countries over. They never got that far though, and I think I honestly didn't find like people quantifying particularly like why, because there's actually not a huge amount written about the Yafei La that I could find. But it seemed to be that they'd try and prime these places and it would just run out of steam, essentially. So they're trying to kind of bring up all these other areas. But I think, again, it suffers from the same thing that you were talking about and we were mentioning before, about developing economies. And they have so many other priorities, and if they're not really angry with the leadership or whatever it is, it's hard to prime them with communist ideals, especially if they're heavily religious places. So like Latin America, super Catholic, actually all those places there's a super Catholic thing, but the thing is some of them are Muslim as well, and the thing is communism fundamentally is about rejection of religion and atheism, and so I think
it's a hard sell.
I think by the lack of information, and the fact that I've never heard an enormous amount of information about these other economies turning communist, except for like the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia and some of the rebel groups that they had throughout Latin America.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was a combined effort though between the Russians and the Chinese. So, and it sort of hit all the things. Like in Latin America is a different story because obviously the Americans themselves, the USA, was constantly involved with counter, like, propaganda.
Yeah.
So they were constantly saying, you're super religious. You don't want communism. They're the devil and blah, blah, blah. And they do all this stuff. And it's just, they completely countered it.
Yeah.
And obviously at the same time, a lot of the ideology demands a fairly violent overthrow. In the Chinese model, it requires essentially, like, literally get guns and fight away all the capitalists kind of thing. And I think a lot of these places didn't have the same mentality yet as the communists did when they did it in China and Russia. So, like, things like the Yafe-La, I think it was like, they must think like us. Let's jump out there and prime them with communism and get rid of all the things that they like and all that sort of stuff. I think that's the fundamental thing, is you need to have an ideology, and that's what it teaches me, is that you really need to have an ideology more like the EU, where you're kind of... you're giving a good version of what they already have. You're not trying to say, get rid of religion. You're not trying to say, let's shoot everyone. You're not doing anything that's going to freak the shit out of people. You know what I mean? Like, because that's any ideology that's that radical, you're going to have some people are going to love you and a lot of people are going to be terrified of you. And you're going to kind of, and that's not really a great recipe for development.
Yeah.
You know?
Terrified if they take you seriously and just mocking if they don't.
Exactly. No.
Neither of which particularly inspire confidence.
And that's why I'm not like that model of like communism and stuff. I'm not a fan of it. I mean, it's not going to work. That's the thing, is some countries have the right recipe there already that it'll mix, and then the peasantry will overthrow whoever it is. But the thing is, global capitalism in a lot of ways has actually spread a certain level of knowledge and wealth to a lot of random places on the planet. I don't think you have the same grounding as what you had in early Russia or early China. I don't think you could create a communist revolution anymore. Not really. I think what you can create now is what is going to be much more beneficial and agreeable, which is like basically people just democratically voting in parties that then agree to create some bigger thing that can do more good. Like the EU, but not half developed. The whole way developed. Which again is my big thing with the EU that I hate, is that it could have been so much and they just stopped halfway because everyone got freaked out. And now they're like, they blame it for them stopping it. It's a complete mess. So yeah, that's the problem. I think that's more of a communism problem than a third world arrangement. But even then, the third world arrangement, the kings don't want to be under the kings. There's a few issues with things like the Yafe-La. So the next one was the attempts at German unification by the German liberals in 1848 and then Otto von Bismarck. So what happened was the liberals basically... So this is a very different term of liberal than what we use now. Liberal at those times means basically the people who believed in moving past monarchies and making republics.
Okay.
So that's basically what a liberal was then. It was like freedom, we shouldn't have a king with absolute authority, we should have a state that has rules and constitutions and stuff. That's what that term meant at the time. So they basically created this whole big vote and they said we should be making a new country that's just one big country rather than a bunch of German states. And we should use the Prussian emperor as our emperor, like our king. So it was like a constitutional monarchy, like the UK.
Okay.
So they were going to have a constitution and a parliament and all that sort of stuff, but they'd still have a monarch. Because obviously it's 1848 and no one was... Not that many people were that progressive yet, even though the Americans had done it by then. The only other experiment with that by Europeans was the French, and they just finished about here now... killing a lot of their population. So kings were still seen as a net win sort of thing in Europe. What happened was they basically did it, but then it never really got anywhere because they had to like appeal to all the princes to do it together, and it's kind of like the same problem they had in Africa.
problem did they have in Africa?
Basically, where the kings didn't want to be under the other kings.
So royalty don't like playing together as a
Yeah. They like intermarrying.
Playing in some definitions.
And
we can't play, but you can have my daughter.
And they like intra-marrying, staying within the family. No, they...
That's another podcast for us.
Oh, yeah, there we go. Monarchical incest. That'll be a whole one. But no, they wanted to stay... The princes all never really agreed, and they were dragging their feet. And it never really failed, but it never really got off the ground, because it's like it was stuck in, like, an eternal negotiation and, like, umming and ahhing, and some of them liked it and some of them didn't, and that kind of thing. You know, it's princes. No one was going to vote them out and put someone else in.
Yeah.
Because they didn't really talk too much about what the German people themselves wanted. Like, the educated people, I mean, at this time, you didn't really have, like, tons of people on Facebook, you know, obviously, saying, I think this.
Yeah, if it's only kind of the top of society that know how to read and write, that's the history that you're going to get.
Yeah.
You don't get to hear from peasants because they didn't write anything down.
No, and the thing, at this time, I think, is probably when general literacy was starting to improve, and you would have had, like, the earliest, like, printout things, like, one page, and it probably would have been the printing press by this point.
What year was it?
1848.
Yeah, I think that.
So this is, like...
kind of...
This is like 10, 15 years before the American Civil War, and they had printing then.
Yeah,
so it was probably there, but the thing is, obviously, it's mostly the really educated people and, like, the princes and things. This is like when princes were sort of like, and all that system was starting to get questioned. But so there was a lot more educated people. But the problem is that they didn't really get anywhere, and then Bismarck came along, so Otto von Bismarck, who led Prussia, and basically just said, I am getting frustrated, this is taking such a long time, and then just conquered all the other states and told them to play nice, basically. So
I mean, that's how it traditionally was done.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And that's the thing, when you have princes who don't want to get under another prince and don't get along, he basically just took them all, and a lot of people died in the process because this was kind of like the German Civil War, and then they unified at the end of that, so like 1890 or something. And I read something that actually made an interesting point that it was like quoted from an encyclopedia or something. I don't know if there was an original quote, but it said that there's a general belief that the failure to do so willingly, to like come together and vote for it and make a peaceful like agreement to create Germany, instead created a country essentially in killing.
Yeah.
So because the foundation of the country was a huge amount of people killing each other, it created, and this was literally like 20 years before World War One. It created a national culture that was essentially based in, you know, victory through military arms is like an ultimate good, almost. Like, it's like we achieved what we were trying to do. For 50 years we failed, and then we succeeded through killing everyone that disagreed, kind of thing. Like, it's a military tradition. It's, if we stand up for it and fight for it, we'll get it, kind of thing. And I think, and so basically they said that kind of created this bedrock of the German state being this military entity, just as Prussia had always been, because there's a famous quote, and I'm going to have to quote it, I'm going to have to like say who said it, but it was that normally a state is a country, sorry, it's a state with an army, but Prussia is an army with a state. It's that basically it's just a tack on to the army being what ran everything, and it's sort of like Germany became a continuation of that by this, when it could have changed. So if anything, it sort of just highlights the point that if we don't do it that way, and then someone takes it upon themselves to do it some other way, we might create sort of what happened with the Soviet Union and China, because you look at the brutality that they had in Cambodia, in Russia, and in China, and all three of those, the communist movements that came through an incredibly violent civil war, and it created an incredibly violent state at the end, because people became, and commanders and civil servants and everything got used to brutality as being essentially a part of governance. So in this case, it's like a testament to what can kind of happen if you sort of let that happen instead of doing things intentionally on your own terms. So yeah, anyway, that was essentially the point around that one. So the next one was the pressures that ultimately drove apart the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires. So the way I saw this, because a lot of people said it's basically... Okay, so Austria-Hungary was two kingdoms, and then at the end of World War One, they lost. Obviously, they lost World War One. They were on they dissolved at the end because people basically lost faith in it, and it split up into two sub-kingdoms. But a lot of the same time, there was a lot of ethnic pressure within both. So the Ottoman Empire separately, but in both of them, there's a lot of ethnic pressure to pull apart these big kingdoms, because a lot of people, I think, use this as an example for what happens when you try and bring together a lot of different ethnicities. Mm-hmm. But another way to look at it, and I think it's a lot more about what was actually going on at the time, was that you didn't have so much an empire of people treated equally. You had, the Austrians and the Hungarians being treated as full citizens, and all the other ones being treated as something less.
Right.
It was kind of, this is the Austro-Hungarian Empire and friends.
Yeah.
So it's like the and friends were usually getting subjugated by the government or whatever, and no one really cared what happened to them because they weren't the two main ones. And the same thing happened with the Ottomans. There was a lot of you were either the Ottomans or you were one of the little sub-bits, like the Armenians, for instance, in the famous Armenian massacre that happened in World War One. So the thing is, I think that's more a testament to what happens when you create an identity and a state based on some particular ethnicity being the top of a pile, and then what happens to all the other ones is they get frustrated and angry and pissed off, obviously, and it doesn't really come together very well. So if you did create a unified state for the whole of humanity, and then you made, say, the Han Chinese and Anglo-Saxons the top of the pile and everyone else sucks, it would break apart.
Yeah.
Eventually, it would break apart because that's a terrible idea. The idea is, if you were to create something unified, you'd need to create something with a unified identity. And the problem that happened this sort of actually leads me straight into the next one, is the Yugoslavians, because Tito was sort of trying to create a single state. And this is probably the closest to what I was thinking. Tito was trying to create essentially a Yugoslavian identity, and he was like, we need to be one thing. But what he kind of had the problem is the Croatians wanted to be their own country, and they wanted to be separate. But a lot of that was also because they perceived the Serbians as being dominating the entire union, and insisting that they should be the top of the pile. Even though Tito didn't really want that, there was a dominant group that was sort of pushing everyone else out, and and at least they perceived that to be a significant problem. And that is sort of the grounding that created the Balkan Wars later.
Right.
And this is why the Serbians got in trouble fighting the Croatians and everything, because no one had really forgotten all this stuff from Yugoslavia. So he actually did, he ended up crushing the Croatian resistance with the army, but the army was mostly Serbian, and so it could have just exacerbated the problem. It's as long as you have this thing lingering where you're allowing certain ethnic and religious groups to kind of dominate other ones, the overarching republic sort of becomes that.
Yeah.
So it becomes that dominant group, and everyone else is sort of having to play ball kind of thing. So however you did it, you definitely have to put controls in place, essentially, to make sure that there's oversight enough that there is none of that happening. And obviously the same thing happens in China, because it's 90% Han Chinese and 10% some other ones. And so the Uyghurs and things in, I can't remember what it's called, that territory in the northwest part, where the Muslim Chinese are.
Oh, yeah.
And so obviously they're a tiny subsection of China, and obviously they're treated like a tiny subsection of China, essentially. So I think all that really highlights is just the importance that you don't allow some group to dominate the whole thing. And then with the previous stuff, it's the same thing, that you need to come in with an identity and an ideological understanding that you're going to be an equal part of a greater thing based on being human.
And I think just having a decent representational democracy helps with that. If you really actively try to allow kind of smaller subcultures or ethnic or religious groups to get have a piece of the power, I suppose, and to have small groups make it possible for them to elect representatives to actually help run the country.
Yeah, exactly. And that's actually part of the reason why when I invented my version of how I think the election should work, is that I think that it should be a regional thing and you have to vote for another region. So you have China, for instance, again, it's where most of the Chinese people live, but they have to vote for another region. They have to vote for whoever the representatives are that they're voting for in America or Russia or whatever it is. Like, the thing is, you have to pick someone from somewhere else.
I guess the problem with that is then you feel like you don't have any control over your own environment, over your own political environment.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the emphasis would have to move to people. I think the first election, everyone would just be really frustrated, and then it would kind of be like, you have to work on talking to the other regions.
Yeah, I can see how that's kind of the ideal of how it would work.
Yeah, I don't know if that's the perfect way to do it, but I think just disseminating the authority so that a massive ethno-religious group or whatever it is can't just vote for themselves and win everything.
Yeah.
That's kind of, or at least have it so parties aren't allowed to be like that. Like,
I mean, that's when you get to, I know the way New Zealand does their voting is a bit better than how everyone else does it, and I can't remember the details.
I know one country has it where if you vote for an area, you get 3 people. Like, you get the top person, the next person, the next person.
Okay.
So, like, they have it's a bigger area, but then you don't get 3 people of the same party. You get the first party, and then whoever was second, whoever was third.
Yeah, I think it's something to do with, like, if 5% of the vote goes to one person or one party, it must be one party, then 5% of the final parliament is from that party. Like, rather than...
Right, yeah. Rather than
kind of first past the
winner
post.
takes all.
Yeah, rather than winner takes all.
Yeah.
And I think that would probably help.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think there's a lot of things they could do to, like, fairly simple things they could do to really dramatically change how well represented people are.
I'm going to say, if anyone's listening from New Zealand, feel free to correct us in the comments.
Yeah, please do.
And we'll blame Carla because she's the only one who assumed all this stuff. And I just said I thought, and you said a bunch of stuff, so Carla's wrong. You're probably right. I don't know. But no, I know what you're talking.
Got the vibe right,
I know what you're talking about with the percentage thing. I've heard that before, and I think it's a good idea.
Yeah, and then, so you have them as the best so far way of democracy works, and then like America as the worst.
Oh yeah, no, that winner take all thing with the presidency and like no preferential voting is insane.
Bonkers.
Is insane. So the last point, because it's probably gone on for ages already. The last point is when unification can go wrong. And the example given was the Anschluss between Germany and Austria. So the Anschluss means the annexation in German. So that's when Germany occupied and annexed Austria at the beginning of World War II, which was like the most peaceful annexation in the world because they were pretty much the same. Like, the Austrians and the Germans thought very similarly about other things, and they were huge fans of Nazism.
Yeah.
So they basically were like, we got... At the end of the world, it was like... At the end of the war, it was like, we got conquered. We weren't part of that. But, like, you see the videos and stuff of, like, the parades when they marched in. Like, there's... Like, I've seen them in documentaries of, like, the Germans marching into Austria, and everyone's just lining the streets and cheering and throwing confetti on them.
And
like, yes, invade us, please!
That wasn't just self-preservation?
It could have been, but they were the only ones that were that enthusiastic.
Yeah, okay.
A lot of people, like, I think what the normal reaction was from the self-preservation point of view was... You just do nothing.
Yeah.
You know, like you if they ask you a question, you smile and tell them an answer, but you wouldn't bring your whole family onto the street to throw a parade.
To throw a party. Yeah.
Because you don't, as a person, you don't need to.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. Like, it's not necessary. But the Austrians were, like, a lot of troops are from Austria. Hitler was Austrian. Like, it's like, yeah.
Yeah, the culture.
And he put his capital, like, the town where all the Nazis stayed was in, I'm sure it was in Austria. It was on the border.
Yeah.
Which was Berchtesgaden. Okay. Which is where the Eagle's Nest is, that fortress in the mountains that Hitler built.
Oh, okay.
And he was meant to go hide there at the end of the war, but then he was crazy by then, so he didn't.
Yeah.
So the idea of that is basically that is an example of when you can get like two what you would call negative forces coming together to make a bigger negative force. But I guess again, it sort of just ties into the ideology thing.
Yeah.
Is you need to be coming into this with the right mentality. You're not coming into it to subjugate an entire species or a race or whatever it is. You're coming into it to create a unified whole that will eventually become a global whole.
Yep.
Like, that is the ideology behind the entire concept. And that's what all the rules are going to be. Because obviously the Nazis didn't have any rules saying you can't discriminate against minorities, because that was like their entire platform.
It's kind of a jam.
So that's the difference I was making, is there's a big, big, big difference between an ethno-fascist alignment and a benign alignment.
Yeah.
Like, if you're it's all about why you're doing it and what the basis of your constitution and everything are that underpin it. If you create a constitution and you create all those things, like, it's fundamentally different for obvious reasons. So the thing is, the constitution's a big part of it, because basically if your constitution says you have to respect human rights, you can't discriminate against minorities, you can't blah, 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 all these other things, then you need to have like a super majority, like a massive majority of the government has to agree to change it. Like, that's the purpose of it, is it's basically, this is the fundamental building blocks of a country. So to change it, everyone needs to think it needs to be changed.
Yeah.
So those are the kinds of protections. That's what America has and things like that, like with the amendments to get rid of slavery and everything else, which obviously enough agreed, and obviously they've never changed it, which is pretty good. Despite, no doubt, a lot of people wanting to right after the Civil War. So those are all the points that were asked. Essentially, they're all attempts and things that people have done with regards to unifying pieces of the world and things like that. And there's a lot of counterpoints I also wrote down with other countries where these things haven't been a problem. They've actually worked, but I thought it was more important, given the amount of time we have, to just go through and nail these like criticisms and say fundamentally why they're different. Because you look at countries like Indonesia, which is a mishmash of tons of subcultures and places. India, again, although India is a weird example because they've kind of just gone Hindi over everything. Because they didn't have anything in the Constitution to say they shouldn't. USA is, like, despite all the problems they have now, they've historically been the biggest success globally for naturalization, in terms of people coming to the country and becoming an American.
Yeah.
They had by far the most success, and it's because they're a country based on ideology.
Yeah.
Instead of being a country based on history and an ethnicity and a religion, they're a country based on an ideology that you come here and you work hard and you're a free person and everything else. Like, that was the fundamental concept behind the place. So for a long time, it was really successful at doing that. And obviously now they're declining economically and they're starting to turn on each other, and it's not quite the same. But the thing is, I think a lot of that still comes down to the fact that they're still a country. And I think if you had a global thing, you wouldn't have one part pulling another part. It would all just be one economy.
Yeah.
And like, things would just move when they need to move. Anyway, again, I'm precariously dipping back into a tangent. So the thing is, that's the end of that episode. Hopefully it was informative. We covered a lot of different things, nothing in very much detail, I'm sorry.
And Shannon mentioned if any New Zealand listeners are able to correct us.
Absolutely.
That's true just of anything. If any listeners want to comment or corrections in particular would be nice.
Absolutely.
Please do reach us. Do we have an email address?
Well, actually, where the most stuff is going up is on the Reddit page, which is the Global Tribe one, which I post on regularly. But we have the Facebook page. I don't have an email address yet, but message me through Facebook and I'll address anything there.
Yeah.
Voting systems, though, would be an interesting thing to cover, because that seems like a really big deal.
That might be something I could dig into.
Yes.
I'd be interested in that.
There you go.
Yeah.
There we go. That'll be a Carla subject rather than me just talking for 7,000 years. Anyway, that's it.
We are working on that.
Slowly. No, we'll
Hashtag silence Daniel.
That would be a movement that Imogen and most of my workplace would get behind. Anyway, yeah, so that's it. That's it for that one. We'll come back to the next one soon, and we'll see you then. This is Daniel. Goodbye.
I've been Carla.
And I've been Shannon.
See ya.
Entire episode so far.
Well done. Well done.
All the way! Woo!